In the fall of 2005, a young mother named Rachel arrived at a roadside motel after hours on the highway, cradling her 6-month-old daughter in her arms. She had driven through most of the night, fighting exhaustion, desperate to get off the interstate and into a room where she could finally rest. By the time she checked in, it was past midnight. The clerk remembered her clearly, a woman in her 20s, pale from fatigue, balancing the weight of a diaper bag on one shoulder and the small bundle of her child in the other arm. She signed the register, was handed a key, and disappeared down the corridor toward a modest single room. That was the last moment anyone outside her family would ever see her alive. The next morning, her car was still parked in the lot, neatly angled between two larger vehicles, as if she had meant to return at any moment. The blinds in her room were drawn, the television glowing softly inside. But Rachel and her baby were nowhere to be found. The housekeeper knocked once, then twice, waiting for the mother to answer. There was no sound of a crying infant, no voice assuring her she would come to the door. Hours slipped by, and still there was nothing. Eventually, the staff grew uneasy. They called the front desk, and the manager tried the door with a spare key. Inside, the room was quiet, untouched, and unsettlingly normal. The diaper bag sat by the dresser, baby clothes folded neatly inside, a bottle half filled with formula tucked in its side pocket. Rachel's purse rested on the nightstand, with her identification and a wallet containing a small amount of cash. Even her phone charger was plugged into the wall, though the phone itself was missing. On the bed, the sheets were pulled tight, tucked in corners with an almost clinical neatness, as though someone had carefully remade it. The only sound was the low electric buzz of the television left running, the screen flickering dimly into the empty room. When police arrived minutes later, they expected signs of a struggle, perhaps evidence of a forced entry, but the door showed no damage. The lock had not been tampered with. The window latches were intact. No one from the other rooms reported hearing a scream, a knock, or a single sound that would suggest violence. To officers, it appeared as if the mother and child had simply walked out the door, but they left everything behind that would make such a departure possible. Detectives began their initial canvass, speaking to other guests. One recalled hearing the faint cry of a baby somewhere around midnight, followed by silence. Another guest said they saw Rachel step outside briefly, rocking the infant in her arms before turning back toward her room. No one could confirm she made it inside again. The front desk clerk insisted he never saw her leave, and the motel's parking lot camera, a low-resolution system installed years earlier, was broken that night. What should have been a clear, decisive record of comings and goings was a blank stretch of corrupted footage. For Rachel's family, the call from police came as a shock that instantly unraveled the fragile routines of their lives. She had left home on a short trip to visit relatives, promising to call as soon as she reached the motel. When hours turned into silence, they assumed fatigue had forced her to sleep late. Now, hearing she and the baby were simply gone, their minds swung between disbelief and terror. They rushed to the motel, staring at the abandoned car in the lot, the packed diaper bag in the room, as if these objects might somehow explain what had happened. But they didn't. They only deepened the horror of her absence. As news spread, locals gathered outside the motel, whispering theories and fears. Strangers posted early flyers with her picture and the image of her infant daughter, asking if anyone had seen them. To outsiders, it looked like a straightforward kidnapping. Yet the investigators on scene struggled with the lack of evidence pointing in any direction. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing was missing. It wasn't an abduction in the usual sense. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle. And it didn't look like a case of a runaway mother. She had no reason to vanish, and even if she had, why would she abandon her belongings? The lead detective on the case later described that first day as a perfect storm of contradictions. Every piece of evidence suggested she intended to stay. Every detail in the room suggested she had vanished without warning. And yet, no one could explain how a woman and her child could simply disappear into the night with no witnesses, no tracks, no trace. The motel became the center of a mystery that would haunt the small town for years to come. By evening, Search dogs had been brought in to sweep the grounds. They followed Rachel's scent briefly across the parking lot but lost it near the back entrance to the property. Beyond that lay a patch of woods and a highway that stretched for miles in either direction. Investigators fanned out, calling her name, holding flashlights into the trees, but the woods gave them nothing back. That night, as family members stood outside the room Rachel had checked into just hours before, the neon motel sign buzzing overhead, the chilling question loomed heavier than ever. How could a mother and her 6-month-old baby vanish overnight, leaving behind every piece of their lives as if they had been erased in an instant? And if they hadn't simply walked away, then who, or what, had taken them? Detectives began their interviews within hours of declaring the case a probable abduction, and their first stop was Rachel's family. Her parents opened their door with faces drained of color, clinging to each other as if the weight of what had happened was too heavy to bear alone. To them, Rachel was not just another missing person. She was their only daughter, the one who called every evening just to say she had gotten home safe, the one who fussed over her baby's routine with relentless devotion. They told detectives there was no possibility she had walked away from her life. Exhausted, yes. Overwhelmed at times, absolutely. But abandoning her 6-month-old? Impossible. Her mother repeated it with certainty, tears slipping down her face. Rachel lived for that child. Detectives pressed for more detail about Rachel's circumstances. Her parents explained that she had been navigating a separation from the baby's father. The relationship had unraveled in recent months, weighed down by arguments over money, long absences, and Rachel's frustration at feeling unsupported. Still, there was no indication she feared him. According to her parents, she had confided that the split, while painful, was necessary, and she had been preparing to build a life on her own. She had found work, enrolled in a childcare program to give her time for shifts, and was managing as best she could. Fatigue showed in her face, but never did she speak of leaving her baby behind. The infant's father was brought in for questioning within 24 hours. He appeared shaken, defensive, and angry that suspicion had already landed on him. He insisted he had not seen Rachel in several weeks and that he had been at work the night she vanished. Detectives verified his time card, but his co-workers described him as distracted and withdrawn that evening. While nothing directly tied him to the motel, his status as the estranged partner, combined with the bitter history between them, kept him squarely in the frame of suspicion. Investigators had to consider every possibility, from a custody dispute gone wrong to a violent act of desperation. Neighbors and friends painted a more complex picture. One recalled Rachel mentioning that she thought she was being followed. Weeks before the motel stay, she had noticed a car lingering near her apartment building more than once, the same pale sedan parked on her street at odd hours, headlights dimmed, as if waiting. Another friend said Rachel dismissed it at first, brushing it off as paranoia born of stress. But by the third or fourth time, she confided she was unsettled. Detectives logged the details carefully. If she had indeed been stalked, then her disappearance at a public roadside motel might not have been random at all. The tension between theories pulled investigators in conflicting directions. Was this a domestic matter? A father lashing out in anger, silencing Rachel, and taking the baby to remove leverage from her life? Or was this the work of a stranger, someone who had been watching, waiting for the moment when she was most vulnerable? Each path held weight, but neither could be proven with what they had. Every interview seemed to leave detectives with more questions than answers, while the family's agony deepened by the day. Rachel's parents became the faces of the case. They stood before microphones, their voices cracking as they pleaded for the safe return of their daughter and grandchild. Local news stations played their words on repeat. The story spread beyond the town, reappearing in regional broadcasts under a chilling label: the motel disappearance. For weeks, the public's imagination filled in the silence left by the absence of facts. Some speculated she had fled, unable to bear the strain of single motherhood. Others whispered about darker scenarios: traffickers, predators, a calculated abduction planned long before that night. At vigils held outside the motel, Candles flickered in paper cups, illuminating posters of Rachel's smiling face and the soft features of her infant daughter. Strangers prayed aloud for their safety. The parking lot where her car still sat became a shrine of flowers and handwritten notes. But for detectives, the gathering crowds only heightened pressure to deliver answers they didn't have. Every tip called in was checked, every supposed sighting logged, none held up under scrutiny. Behind closed doors, suspicion still circled the baby's father. His denials were firm, but investigators were trained to look past words to the silences, the hesitations. He bristled when asked whether Rachel had ever threatened to limit his access to the child, whether she had implied he might lose custody altogether. Detectives wondered, could resentment and fear of losing his daughter have driven him to something irreversible? Yet without evidence, without even a single thread tying him to that motel, the theory remained just that, a suspicion. As weeks passed, the family fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Arguments erupted over theories, trust dissolved, and every unanswered phone call felt like a betrayal of hope. Rachel's parents clung to the belief she was alive somewhere, waiting to be found. But late at night, when the house fell quiet, even they struggled against the creeping fear that the silence meant something else entirely. The case had begun to drift toward that dangerous precipice, the edge where the trail cools and the urgency of the first days fades. Yet, just as detectives braced for the possibility of running out of leads, a new detail emerged from those closest to Rachel, one that would cast the entire investigation in an even darker light. A car she had feared, a pattern she had noticed, and the unsettling thought that maybe her disappearance had been planned long before she stepped into that motel room. Investigators knew that if answers existed, they were likely still somewhere inside that modest roadside motel. The room where Rachel and her infant had stayed was sealed off with crime scene tape, and forensic teams moved through it inch by inch, collecting fibers, photographing every corner, and dusting for prints. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, a budget room with outdated wallpaper and a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. But detectives were haunted by the contradictions it held: a purse full of money and identification untouched, a diaper bag prepared for the next day, a bed that looked almost too carefully remade. Nothing about it fits with the image of a mother choosing to vanish on her own. The night clerk became a critical witness. He recalled that sometime after midnight, Rachel had walked through the dim hallway, her baby balanced on her hip. He said she looked tired but calm, stepping outside into the cool air of the parking lot. He assumed she was trying to soothe the infant back to sleep, but what unsettled detectives was what came after. He was certain he never saw her come back through the lobby. For him, she had simply stepped outside and then disappeared. No alarm was raised at the time because nothing about it struck him as unusual. Parents with babies often paced outside for air. Only in hindsight did that detail weigh heavily on the investigation. Other guests filled in fragments of the night soundscape. One couple reported hearing the faint cry of a baby just after midnight. The sound had carried through the thin motel walls, sharp enough to rouse them. But after a few minutes, the cries stopped. They assumed the child had been comforted back to sleep. Another guest, staying a few doors down, thought he heard footsteps in the corridor in those same early hours, hurried, uneven, though he could not say if it was Rachel or someone else. Each detail seemed plausible, but none provided the certainty investigators needed. Search efforts spread quickly beyond the room itself. Officers scoured the parking lot with flashlights, examining every corner for discarded items or evidence of struggle. They searched dumpsters, believing perhaps something, a blanket, clothing, even the infant's bottle, might have been hastily thrown away. The containers were emptied and sifted through piece by piece. Nothing belonging to Rachel or her baby was found. Beyond the motel's rear fence, dense woods pressed against the property line. Search dogs were led into the trees, handlers calling Rachel's name. For a brief moment, the dogs picked up a trace, circling a section of brush, but the trail evaporated near the highway. The possibility that a vehicle had been waiting nearby to spirit her away became impossible to ignore. Detectives began piecing together theories to explain the silence left behind. One was the voluntary disappearance theory. Perhaps Rachel, overwhelmed by separation and the pressures of raising an infant alone, had chosen to walk away from her life. But this theory faltered almost immediately. If she had intended to leave, why would she abandon her purse, her money, her car, and the essentials for her child? Those items represented survival. No mother fleeing with her baby would leave them behind. The next theory was abduction. The thought that someone had been watching her, waiting for a vulnerable moment, matched the detail of her stepping outside at night. If she had gone into the parking lot with her child, she could have been intercepted in seconds, pulled into a waiting car. But once again, the evidence refused to cooperate. There were no witnesses who saw a struggle, no tire marks indicating a sudden getaway, no security footage to trace movements. The motel's outdated camera system had failed on the one night it was most needed, leaving detectives blind to the crucial window of time. Then came the theory no one wanted to say aloud but could not ignore, that something had happened inside the motel itself. Some investigators whispered about the possibility of an accident covered up by staff. Could the infant have died during the night, leading to panic and a desperate attempt to conceal what had happened? Could Rachel herself have been harmed, her absence explained not by escape or abduction, but by something far darker within those walls? The staff denied everything, their records clean, their statements consistent. Yet the idea lingered in the case files, another unproven shadow among many. Each path detectives followed seemed to collapse under its own weight. Witnesses contradicted each other. Forensic tests came back inconclusive. What evidence was gathered painted an incomplete and frustratingly hollow picture. And yet, despite the lack of answers, the motel itself took on an unsettling aura in the minds of investigators and locals alike. It became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of the unknown, a place where a mother and her child had stepped into the night and never returned. By the end of those first weeks, detectives were left with fragments of possibilities: voluntary disappearance, abduction, accident, cover-up, but not a single piece of hard proof to anchor the case. Each theory looked convincing for a moment, but when investigators tried to press further, the evidence dissolved into nothing. It was as if the motel had swallowed its own secrets, and in that silence, the case teetered dangerously close to stalling, leaving the family desperate for answers and the investigators haunted by a simple, unshakable question. If not here, then where? Detectives soon shifted their focus from the physical space of the motel to the people who had been in its orbit the night Rachel and her baby vanished. Every registered offender within a 5-mile radius was pulled into the net. One man in particular drew immediate attention, a convicted sex offender who lived less than a mile away in a small, weathered trailer just off the highway. He was known to law enforcement, his name appearing frequently in reports of loitering near schools and shopping centers. When questioned, he appeared nervous, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. But he maintained that he had been at his sister's house that night, caring for her children. Detectives checked, and frustratingly, his alibi held up. Family members confirmed his story, and even phone records placed him away from the motel during those critical hours. Though suspicion lingered, investigators were forced to move on. The spotlight then fell on a long-haul truck driver whose rig had been parked across the street from the motel that same night. His logbook showed troubling irregularities: hours that didn't align, unexplained gaps in his route, and mileage that suggested detours. To detectives, the picture was alarming. A truck offered both concealment and mobility. If Rachel had been forced inside, she and her baby could have been carried across state lines before dawn, erased from the area entirely. The driver insisted he had been sleeping in his cab, taking mandatory rest breaks. Yet when investigators pressed, he struggled to recall details of his night. Did he hear a baby crying from across the lot? Did he see a young woman step into the night air? His answers wavered. Still, a sweep of his truck turned up nothing. No fibers, no DNA, no trace of mother or child. The suspicion was strong, but the evidence refused to match. As the investigation dragged on, Whispers began to spread among locals. The motel itself, they said, was no stranger to trouble. Detectives learned it had become a quiet hub for drug activity, frequented by dealers and users who operated in the shadows of late-night check-ins. The rumor that Rachel had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time began to take hold. Perhaps someone had mistaken her for another target, a guest connected to debts or deals. If so, the result could have been a tragic case of mistaken identity. Detectives explored the theory, interviewing known associates tied to the motel, but again, the trail produced nothing solid. The theory lingered, unsettling but unproven. The community, once galvanized, began to fracture under the weight of speculation. Some pointed fingers at the baby's father, convinced the fractured relationship explained everything. Others looked toward strangers, men in the wrong place at the wrong time, drifters, truckers, offenders, whose names appeared in records but never in courtrooms. The lack of clear evidence allowed rumor to fill the gaps, and each new theory seemed more frightening than the last. Families traveling through the area began avoiding the motel entirely, and its reputation sank deeper into infamy. Meanwhile, detectives worked relentlessly to push the case beyond county lines. They issued nationwide alerts, distributing Rachel's photo and her infant's likeness to truck stops, bus stations, and airports. Flyers were posted in neighboring states, hotline numbers printed beneath her image. Yet weeks turned into months without a single credible sighting. Each reported lead collapsed quickly. A woman seen boarding a bus turned out to be a different passenger. A baby in a shopping mall matched neither age nor appearance. It was as though Rachel and her daughter had slipped beneath the surface of everyday life, invisible. Inside the investigation room, maps stretched across the walls, pins marking every possible sighting, every tip that had once seemed promising. Red strings connected theories that no longer held weight. The truck driver's irregular logs, the offender's uneasy interview, the motel's criminal underbelly. Each one offered a glimpse of possibility, but ended in silence. The detectives, once brimming with urgency, now sat with furrowed brows and empty hands. Each morning they returned to the same evidence, the same unanswered questions. The case began to weigh heavily on those closest to it. The lead investigator admitted privately that he felt haunted, unable to drive past the motel without feeling the chill of failure. He would recall the flicker of the neon sign above the entrance, the silent car still parked in the lot, the haunting absence of voices where there should have been laughter or cries. For Rachel's family, the silence was worse than any confirmed tragedy. They lay awake at night imagining what could have happened, replaying each scenario detectives floated, clinging to slivers of hope while bracing for horrors they dared not name. As winter settled in and months passed, the reality hardened. Despite suspects and theories, no one had seen Rachel since that night, and no one could explain where her daughter had gone. Each path investigators walked eventually collapsed into dead ends, leaving behind only a growing sense of dread. The motel still stood, its rooms filling nightly with new guests, but its walls carried a story that was unresolved and growing colder by the day. And as the family clung to dwindling hope, investigators began to fear that the truth of what had happened might remain hidden forever, unless a new piece of evidence surfaced to bring the shadows into focus. 1 year after Rachel and her baby vanished, the momentum that had once fueled the investigation had withered away. Detectives who had once pored over her file daily were reassigned to new cases, each one pressing for attention with fresher leads and more immediate demands. The motel room had been swept for the third time, its carpets stripped, its linens tested in the hope that some overlooked detail might emerge. The results were depressingly ordinary. Trace fibers, strands of hair from countless guests, and nothing that tied directly to Rachel or her daughter. What had once been treated as a top priority became another folder in a cabinet, one more haunting name added to the ever-growing list of missing persons. Her family, though, had no such luxury of detachment. For them, time did not dull the wound. Each birthday was marked with a cake no one touched, a candle burned in silence before being extinguished without a wish. Holidays turned into hollow rituals, the empty space at the table impossible to ignore. Her parents described how they would wrap gifts each year, small tokens meant for a baby who would now have been a child, a teenager, and later, nearly grown. Each gift remained unopened, tucked away in boxes that filled the corners of their home, reminders of years stolen away. In the beginning, neighbors and community members rallied around the family, organizing vigils, fundraisers, and prayer circles. But as months stretched into years, the calls grew less frequent, the flyers were taken down, and the vigils went unattended. Public interest, once urgent and raw, faded with time. For those outside the family, life moved on. For those within it, time felt frozen. Every day, another reminder that Rachel and her daughter had not come home. The motel, meanwhile, carried on with its business. New families checked into its rooms. Travelers stopped briefly on their way to other destinations, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. The neon sign buzzed nightly. The beds were made fresh each morning, and no trace of Rachel lingered for the guests who followed. To the casual visitor, it was just another roadside stop. But for those who knew its history, it remained a place of unease, a backdrop to unanswered questions. Detectives who had once sat with Rachel's parents admitted later that the case haunted them. They could not drive past the motel without feeling the weight of failure pressing against their conscience. Yet in the absence of evidence, their hands were tied. There was no crime scene, no clear suspect, no body. Without those, the case could not move forward. All that remained was speculation, each theory more painful than the last. Had Rachel been taken by a stranger who saw an opportunity in her vulnerability? Had she been silenced by someone closer, someone investigators had overlooked? Or had an accident occurred, leaving her trapped in a nightmare scenario she could not escape? The family clung to hope with desperate tenacity. They wrote letters to television programs, begged national outlets to cover the case, and even consulted private investigators. Each time, they were met with the same refrain. Without new leads, there was nothing to build on. The file sat in the evidence room, a reminder of both tragedy and the limits of what could be uncovered. Over the years, anniversaries of her disappearance came and went. Some were marked by brief articles in local papers, others passed without mention. For Rachel's parents, the silence was unbearable. They described how they would stare at the door on certain evenings, half expecting her to walk in, carrying her child, as though the nightmare might finally end. But the door never opened, and the silence deepened. 15 years is a long time to carry grief. It changed the family, shaped every decision, and hardened them against the casual sympathy of others. The motel remained in operation through it all, its rooms filled with strangers unaware that beneath the fresh linens and neutral decor, the shadow of a young mother and her baby still lingered. Travelers. Checked in, slept soundly, and checked out, never knowing that they were walking across the same floors where a life had splintered and vanished. The cold case became less a matter of active investigation and more a story passed along in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about a woman who stepped into a motel one night and was never seen again. But the truth of what had happened remained locked away, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when time and chance would finally pry it loose. And when that moment came, it would reveal something so disturbing that it would not only explain the mystery, but change the family's understanding of those long, silent years. 15 years passed before the motel that had become synonymous with Rachel's disappearance changed hands. The building had grown tired with age, its carpets were worn thin, its wallpaper yellowed, and its rooms carried the stale scent of years of neglect. New ownership promised a fresh start, modern renovations, updated furnishings, a chance to shed the reputation that clung to it like a shadow. Contractors were brought in, tasked with stripping the place down to its bones and rebuilding it into something that could attract travelers again. For the workers, it was just another job, another set of rooms to gut and rebuild. For the town, it was simply a business changing hands. No one expected what the renovations would reveal. One afternoon, a small crew entered the room that, according to old police records, had once been sealed off by yellow tape. For years it had been rented out like any other, its association with the disappearance forgotten by most. The workers treated it no differently than the others. They pulled down curtains, rolled up stained carpeting, and carried out dated furniture. The last task was to remove the bed, a heavy, old-fashioned wooden frame that had been in place since before Rachel checked in all those years ago. Two men lifted the mattress and box spring, preparing to break the frame apart for disposal. It was then that something caught their eye. Between the slats, wedged so tightly it had likely gone unseen for years, was a bundle of fabric. At first glance, it looked like discarded clothing or trash stuffed into the crevice by a careless guest. One worker reached in, tugged at the material, and felt it resist. As they pulled harder, pieces of fabric came loose, revealing layers that had been compressed by time. The fabric was small, patterned faintly with faded colors, and when they spread it out across the stripped mattress, a chill settled over the room. It was not trash at all, but a fragment of what appeared to be an infant's blanket. The discovery unsettled the crew. They exchanged looks, half joking about the motel's dark history. But the mood shifted quickly when one man noticed something else lodged deeper within the wooden frame. At first, he thought it was just splintered debris, but the shape was wrong, jagged in a way that sent a bolt of unease through him. With a crowbar, they pried apart the wood, and out fell something small and brittle, something that did not belong in a bed frame. One worker stepped back immediately, the realization hitting before the words could form. What they had uncovered was not just fabric, it was a fragment of human bone. The room that had once been cleaned and rented to countless travelers was instantly transformed into a crime scene again. Work stopped immediately, and the foreman made the call no one expected to ever make again. Within the hour, the motel was surrounded by patrol cars, the site eerily similar to the one from 15 years earlier. Detectives who had long since moved on were notified, and the case that had grown cold was suddenly wide open once more. Forensic teams swarmed the room, treating the bed frame as if it were a vault of secrets. They carefully removed every piece of fabric, every fragment, cataloging them with painstaking detail. The infant's blanket was unmistakable, a near match to one described in the original missing persons report, its colors dulled but still discernible. More bone fragments were uncovered within the slats, fragile but telling. The workers stood silently outside, shaken by the realization that for years they had unknowingly walked through a room concealing evidence of a child's death. News spread quickly, reigniting memories of the case long buried in the public's mind. Rachel and her baby's names returned to headlines, this time paired with words that brought a fresh wave of horror. Remains found. For her family, the call from police reopened wounds they had spent years trying to live with. 15 years of silence had not prepared them for the reality that part of the mystery had been hidden within the very room Rachel had last been seen in. Detectives faced the grim task of piecing together what had been concealed for so long. The discovery of infant remains inside the bed frame suggested a chilling possibility. The baby had never left the room alive. But what it meant for Rachel was less clear. Had she hidden the remains herself in a panic? Or had someone else placed them there, ensuring no one would find them? The evidence pointed to tragedy, but the exact story behind it remained locked in the walls of the motel, waiting for deeper investigation to bring the full truth to light. What began as a renovation project meant to erase the building's past had instead uncovered its darkest secret. And now, with fresh evidence in hand, detectives were left to unravel a mystery that had been buried not in the woods or on the highway, but inside the very bed where a mother and child were supposed to have found rest. The discovery made one thing clear. The motel had kept its secret long enough, and the truth, however disturbing, was finally clawing its way to the surface. When forensic teams returned to the motel room, they approached it with a precision that contrasted starkly with the chaos of its discovery. The bed frame, heavy and warped with age, was carefully dismantled under the glare of bright work lamps. Every nail was pulled, every slat catalogued, every fragment placed in evidence bags. What they uncovered confirmed the workers' suspicions in the most devastating way. Beneath the layers of wood and dust lay remnants no one expected to see again after 15 years. A torn infant blanket, its pastel pattern still faintly visible despite time and decay. The fabric matched the description given by Rachel's family in the earliest days of the investigation, the very same blanket often seen wrapped around her baby in photographs released to the public. Forensic gloves lifted the bundle gently, and beneath it came something worse. Brittle, pale fragments of bone, unmistakable in their delicacy and size. These were not splinters of furniture or debris from renovation. They were human remains, the kind that once belonged to a body impossibly small. Alongside them were faint traces of dried biological matter, residue absorbed into the wood over the years, invisible to the naked eye, but undeniable to modern testing. The motel room, rented to countless strangers over a decade and a half, had been hiding the truth in plain sight. The workers who had stumbled on the discovery stood outside in silence, shaken, some unable to continue their shift. The atmosphere around the building shifted overnight from renovation to crime scene. Local officers rushed to secure the property, sealing it off with yellow tape once again. For the second time in 15 years, the room became the epicenter of an investigation, but this time, the silence was filled with a chilling certainty. Part of the mystery had finally been answered. Within days, the state crime lab confirmed what investigators already feared. The remains belonged to Rachel's infant daughter. DNA comparisons with samples collected from the original investigation made the match definitive. News outlets broke the story nationwide, reigniting a case long believed to be unsolvable. Headlines carried the chilling truth: the baby had never left that motel room. For the public, it was an unthinkable revelation. For Rachel's family, it was a devastating blow that tore open wounds they had spent years trying to stitch closed. They had prayed for hope, for the possibility that both mother and child were living somewhere unseen. Now they were forced to confront the reality that the baby had died in the very place she was last seen alive. Detectives who had once worked the case expressed disbelief that such evidence had remained hidden for so long. They revisited the original search reports, the crime scene photos, the lists of items cataloged. At the time, the bed had been checked, but not dismantled. Its weight and construction made it appear solid, unyielding, an unlikely place to conceal anything. In the rush of those first days, with pressure mounting and suspicions flying in every direction, the bedframe had been overlooked. What seemed ordinary had, in fact, been the key to everything. The chilling realization spread through the community. Guests had slept in that room for years, unaware of what lay inside the very furniture that supported them. Housekeepers had changed sheets, children had jumped on the mattress, and weary travelers had rested just inches above the remains of a child. The horror of it spread far beyond the family, embedding itself in the town's collective memory. For investigators, the discovery clarified one thing, but left a darker question unresolved. The baby's death was no longer in doubt, but how she died and what became of Rachel remained unanswered. Did the infant suffocate accidentally in the night, prompting a panicked attempt to conceal the body? Did someone else in the motel harm the child and hide the evidence? Or had Rachel herself, under unimaginable stress, been responsible for a tragedy that spiraled out of control? Each possibility carried its own weight of grief and horror, and each demanded closer examination. The renewed investigation brought the case back into the national spotlight. Television crews gathered outside the motel, their lights washing over the same parking lot where Rachel had last been seen. Interviews with her parents replayed their anguish for the world to see. Experts debated on air how such evidence could have remained concealed and whether the original investigation had been mishandled. Former detectives admitted that the missed bed frame would haunt them for the rest of their careers. But beneath the noise of headlines and speculation was the deeper truth. Rachel's baby had never left that room alive. That fact reshaped the entire trajectory of the case. It meant the disappearance was not a mystery of abduction from the parking lot or of being whisked away in a truck. The tragedy had occurred in that motel in those early hours of the night, and if the baby had died there, then the key to what happened to Rachel herself might also be found not in wild theories or distant suspects, but within the quiet, suffocating confines of that same room. For the family, closure remained distant. They had an answer, but not the one they had prayed for. The discovery resolved only half of the nightmare, leaving them with an even more agonizing question. If the baby's remains were in the bed frame, then where had Rachel gone? And why had she never come home? The investigators, now armed with this horrifying new evidence, prepared to dig deeper into the past, hoping to untangle whether Rachel was a victim alongside her daughter, or whether she had been the one to leave her behind. Detectives approached the reopened case with a renewed sense of urgency, knowing that the discovery of the infant's remains inside the bed frame reshaped everything they had once believed. The original theories of abduction or a stranger's intervention no longer held the same weight. What they had before them now was evidence that the baby had died in the room itself within hours of Rachel's check-in. Forensic specialists re-examined the bed frame, the blanket, and the bone fragments. Their findings pointed toward suffocation, not from violence, but more likely from a tragic accident. The mattress and bedding in that room had been old, poorly maintained, with stuffing compressed unevenly. It was possible the baby had rolled into a gap or been trapped in a fold of fabric. Another chilling possibility was raised. The bed frame itself had partially collapsed inward, pinning the child in a way that would have gone unnoticed until it was too late. Investigators imagined the scenario step by step. A young mother, already exhausted from a long drive and weeks of single parenting, finally collapses into bed in the early hours. Her child, restless, stirs and cries. At some point in the night, the baby is placed on the bed beside her, but in the dark, as fatigue overtakes her, something happens. When she wakes again, it is to the horror of discovering her child unresponsive. Faced with the unthinkable, her mind races through panic, a guilt, and the certainty that she would be blamed. To the outside world, it would look like neglect, or worse. The concealment of the body inside the bed frame began to make a tragic kind of sense. In her desperation, Rachel may have chosen the only place within reach that could hide the infant from immediate discovery. The torn blanket wrapped around the remains suggested haste, not calculation. But the decision raised a larger, more haunting question. If she had hidden her child's body there, what happened to her afterward? Why had she vanished as completely as her daughter, only to leave behind her car, her wallet, and every trace of her life? Forensic timelines reconstructed from the evidence confirmed that the baby's death had occurred in the motel room. But when detectives compared that to witness statements from the original investigation, contradictions emerged. The night clerk recalled seeing Rachel step outside with the infant still in her arms. A guest remembered hearing crying after midnight. Yet if the child had already died in the room, how did those details fit? Detectives considered that witnesses might have been mistaken, misremembering sounds or faces after the fact. Another theory suggested Rachel had carried her child outside in distress, hoping fresh air might revive her before returning to the room and facing the truth of what had happened. The most agonizing part of the reinvestigation was Rachel's fate. One camp of investigators believed she had fled, overcome by despair, abandoning everything behind in the belief that she could not survive what she had done. To them, the lack of forced entry, the missing phone, and the absence of struggle pointed toward voluntary disappearance. Others doubted she had left alone. If she had, why take no money? Why leave her car untouched? And why had there been no confirmed sightings of her in the days and years that followed? This uncertainty gave rise to another, darker theory, that someone else had been involved after the fact. If Rachel had confided in another person about what happened, or if someone in the motel discovered the truth before she could act, they may have chosen to silence her. Concealing the baby's remains explained one part of the mystery, but Rachel's vanishing suggested she too may have become a victim. Investigators considered whether staff, criminals passing through, or even someone she knew might have played a role in ensuring her disappearance matched the tragedy of her child's. The case files are filled with timelines, reconstructed hour by hour. What time Rachel checked in, when she was last seen alive, when the baby's cries were reported, when the room fell into silence. Each event was plotted, and yet there were gaps no amount of forensic testing could fill. Investigators could now say with certainty that the child had died inside the motel, but every theory about Rachel remained speculative. The family, once again thrust into the public eye, faced impossible emotions. To learn that the infant's death may have been accidental did little to ease their grief. Instead, it added another layer of torment, the possibility that Rachel had suffered the guilt of it alone before disappearing forever. If she fled, then perhaps she lived out her years consumed by a secret too heavy to share. If someone silenced her, then the tragedy was even more cruel than they could bear. Detectives struggled to reconcile the two halves of the story: a baby whose remains were left hidden in the frame of a bed, and a mother who vanished without explanation. Theories stacked upon each other, but none fit perfectly. For every possibility raised, there was another detail that didn't align. But one fact could no longer be ignored. The night was not a story of strangers and abduction, but of tragedy contained entirely within the walls of that room. And if Rachel had lived long enough to know what she had done, the truth of her fate was waiting somewhere out there, still hidden, as investigators prepared to follow the trail further into the shadows of her vanished life. When investigators reopened the case after the motel discovery, their focus shifted with new intensity to Rachel herself. For years, she had been a ghost, a name on a missing persons list, her fate speculated upon but never confirmed. But with the infant's remains identified, detectives believed the mother's disappearance might hold the final answers. They began combing through records overlooked during the initial investigation, searching for any trace of movement that might explain what happened after she left the motel behind. What they found first was subtle, but telling. A financial audit revealed a small withdrawal from Rachel's bank account the morning after her supposed disappearance. It was made from an ATM just a few blocks from the bus station in town. The transaction had been logged at 8:43 a.m., hours after police assumed she had vanished. At the time, the withdrawal was dismissed as a possible clerical error or the work of someone else using her card. Now, in light of the motel discovery, it carried an entirely different weight. It suggested that Rachel had left the motel alive and had walked away carrying a secret she could not bear. Detectives followed the lead to the bus terminal. Archived surveillance footage no longer existed, but records of ticket purchases told a partial story. A woman traveling alone bought a one-way ticket to a city 2 hours away. Witnesses interviewed at the time, but never seriously pursued, recalled a young mother who looked pale and disoriented, boarding a morning bus. She carried no child. The baby blanket was not with her. Her luggage consisted of a small purse clutched tightly against her chest. The resemblance to Rachel was striking enough that investigators could no longer ignore the possibility. From there, the trail grew faint but not invisible. Shelter records 2 states away revealed a woman registering under a false name just days after the disappearance. She described herself as fleeing a relationship, offered no identification, and stayed for less than 2 weeks before leaving without notice. Staff at the shelter remembered her vividly. She seemed exhausted, jumpy, reluctant to answer questions. She rarely slept, and when she did, she sometimes woke in tears. At the time, no one connected her to the missing mother on the news. Years later, those same shelter records would become a crucial link in the chain of evidence. The trail of aliases stretched further, weaving through low-income housing applications, clinic records, and sporadic employment files. Each identity carried minor inconsistencies, but DNA technology had advanced to the point where cold cases could be re-examined with tools once unimaginable. A sample collected years later from an unclaimed death certificate revealed the truth. The woman who had died quietly of illness in a county hospital, listed under yet another assumed name, was in fact Rachel. Cross-checks against her parents' DNA confirmed the match beyond any doubt. The missing mother had lived in the shadows for years, never returning home, never reclaiming her true name. The discovery painted a portrait of a life spent in hiding, haunted by what had happened that night in the motel room. Investigators now believed Rachel discovered her child unresponsive and, in a moment of panic, concealed the body in the bed frame. Overcome by fear of blame and shame, she fled the motel at dawn, leaving behind her car, her identification, and every anchor to her former life. She moved from place to place, building fragile identities that always unraveled, never staying long enough for anyone to know her story. In the end, illness claimed her quietly, far from the family who had mourned her for 15 years. For her parents, the revelation was shattering. They had clung to the belief that both their daughter and granddaughter had been taken, victims of a crime that kept them from home. Now they faced the reality that the infant's death was an accident hidden in fear, and that Rachel had chosen to disappear rather than confront the aftermath. It was not malice that drove her, but terror, guilt, and the crushing weight of responsibility. The silence that followed was not a mystery orchestrated by others, but a choice made in desperation that consumed the rest of her life. Detectives closed the file with grim certainty. The case that had once seemed a puzzle of abduction and conspiracy was, at its core, a story of tragedy compounded by fear. The infant had died in the room, and the mother had fled, living out her days under borrowed names until her body could no longer carry the burden. The nationwide mystery that had fueled speculation for years now ended not with villains or hidden networks, but with the devastating truth of a mother's despair. Yet one haunting question remained in the minds of those who worked the case. If the bed frame had not been dismantled, if the truth had not been pried from its wooden slats, would anyone have ever known? The answer was as unsettling as the tragedy itself. It had taken 15 years and a chance renovation to uncover the secret Rachel had tried to bury. And though her story finally reached its end, it left behind a lingering silence, the echo of a life undone by a single night, and the devastating choices that followed. The truth of the case did not arrive with the shock of a sudden revelation, but rather as a slow, devastating realization pieced together through evidence, timelines, and the final traces of a woman who spent her life running. Forensic analysis of the bed frame and the remains left inside told a story that was both heartbreaking and tragically plausible. The infant had not been abducted, not spirited away by strangers in the night. She had died in that motel room, likely from accidental suffocation caused by the very bed meant to provide rest. The heavy wooden frame, warped and unstable, had left gaps where a baby could slip unnoticed in the darkness. Whether through bedding that folded against her face or slats that collapsed inward, the result was the same, a preventable accident hidden by neglect. Investigators believed Rachel awoke to discover her child unresponsive, and in that moment, her world collapsed. She was young, alone, and terrified. The thought of explaining what had happened, of facing questions from police, from her estranged partner, from her parents, must have seemed unbearable. Panic overcame reason. Instead of seeking help, she made a decision born of fear. She wrapped the baby in the familiar blanket and placed her in the cavity of the bed frame, believing it was the only way to keep the tragedy from immediate discovery. It was a desperate, irrational act, but one that investigators concluded fit the evidence now uncovered 15 years later. Her next steps were no less tragic. By morning, Rachel withdrew a small amount of cash and boarded a bus, leaving behind her car, her belongings, and every link to the life she had known. From there, she built a fragile existence of false names, short stays, and jobs that left no trail. She was not a woman who rebuilt her life in freedom. She was a woman consumed by guilt, living in hiding, haunted by the secret she carried. Years later, she died quietly in a hospital under an assumed identity, her true name only uncovered when DNA confirmed the connection. The conclusion cut deeply for her family, who had spent years believing in darker possibilities. They had feared kidnappers, predators, conspiracies, and cold-blooded violence. To learn instead that the truth was an accident followed by a desperate cover-up brought little comfort. It was not closure in the way they had hoped. It was the unveiling of a reality that their daughter had not been taken from them, but had chosen to vanish under the crushing weight of her own choices. For her parents, the hardest truth to bear was that Rachel could have come home at any point during those years, but never did. The motel itself became a symbol of the tragedy. Its neglect had allowed the bedframe to remain in place long after it should have been replaced. A structure that should have been safe for weary travelers instead became the silent cause of a child's death. Investigators noted bitterly that if proper maintenance had been performed, the accident might never have happened. The ripple effect of one overlooked hazard had stretched into decades of grief, unanswered questions, and a family's torment. National coverage labeled the case as both haunting and infuriating. It was not the dramatic abduction that headlines had once suggested, nor was it the sinister crime of a stranger. It was a slow-motion disaster, an accident compounded by fear, silence, and the failure of a young mother who could not face what had happened. The public reacted with a mix of sorrow and anger. Some sympathized with Rachel, imagining the panic of that night and the impossible weight she carried afterward. Others condemned her decision, arguing that her choice to flee had turned a tragedy into a mystery that scarred her family for years. For law enforcement, the closing of the case was bittersweet. Detectives who had lived with the unanswered questions for more than a decade finally had a resolution, but it was one that underscored the fallibility of their own work. The bed had been checked superficially during the first investigation, but never dismantled. The very evidence that solved the case had been there all along, hidden inches away, overlooked in the rush to find answers. Some admitted privately that this failure would haunt them for the rest of their careers. As the final report was filed, the case ended, not with justice served, but with a grim understanding of how accidents, fear, and neglect can combine into tragedy. Rachel's infant daughter had never left that room. Rachel herself had lived out her life in exile from her own name and family, and all of it had been buried beneath 15 years of silence, only revealed when a renovation forced open the bedframe that had carried the secret all along. In the end, the motel's reputation as the site of a mystery was replaced by something more devastating, the knowledge that the truth had always been there, hidden within its walls, waiting to be uncovered. The case closed with the disturbing reality that no one had been taken by force, no shadowy suspect had orchestrated the disappearance. It was a tragedy born of chance, compounded by human panic, and left unresolved until time and circumstance forced the truth into the light. For Rachel's family, the resolution brought an end to speculation, but not to grief. Their daughter and granddaughter were both gone, not stolen, not hidden by strangers, but lost to a single night and a chain of choices that could never be undone.